Right. Right. Pray silence for the masterful, my good friend, Mr. Andy Davies.
So, good evening. I'd like to start by telling you about Amy. Amy runs development for a UK retailer. She looks after several teams of developers. Recently, they went through the process of launching a new brand. They had an existing site and they wanted to launch a new brand. And they worked hard, Amy and her teams worked hard to build a site that was performant, that was accessible, that from user testing was really easy to use. But then Amy and the people who work for her run into the challenge. They run into the challenge that they want to put this site live. So they have a marketing department who want to know who are visiting the site. So they add analytics. They look at the analytics and they begin to see that not as many people are converting as they thought should be converting. So what they do is they add some session capture software so they can see where people are getting stuck. They then take what they learn from the session cam software. They can see where people are getting stuck and they have some ideas about how they can get them unstuck. They have some hypotheses they want to test. So they add A/B testing. During testing these hypotheses, they sort of begin to understand that, people buy more when we personalize the experience to them. When they say that, people who bought this shirt or this dress like this one also. So
Didn't like that one.
They didn't like that one. Look, my friend, just because your powers are weak tonight.
You wanted heckling, I'm going to do it, right?
So they add personalization and they begin to understand how personalizing the experience helps people spend more, helps people buy more. Then they think, social proof, things like showing people who like this product, people can't see it for real. He's putting me off a track. People can't see it for real, so they look at what other people say about the product and decide they're going to buy it based on those recommendations. Then, they decide they're not getting enough traffic in, so they pull in, they have a window for affiliates, or they do a relationship with Skimlinks or somebody else to start pulling referral traffic in. And then, they decide they want to run some advertising to pull some even more traffic in. And, Amy's team have worked really hard. They've got this waterfall that's pretty short. It's pretty fast. And then slowly, over time, the waterfall of the site they've built goes from that thing of beauty to something very, very different. And I'm sure it's an experience that's familiar to many of us. So why does this happen? And I think we have to consider that, we all add third parties to our site. None of our sites are islands. We all live in a wider ecosystem. And when I talk about third parties, I tend to choose Guy Pajani's definition from, nearly 4 years ago now, that third parties are infrastructure and code that's run by somebody else. And that can cover everything from effectively image CDNs, although there's generally no code involved on your site from that, to things like jQuery going off Google APIs, right through to all those A/B testing and personalization and session recording and yada, 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 because there are lots of them. So when I talk about third parties, this is what I mean by third parties. Before we sort of skip on, does anybody load jQuery from a third-party CDN? Oh, there's one person who's brave enough. The thing. So there's this. Almost there. So one of the things is, we'll get on to commercial third parties, because I often think about third parties as people we've got commercial relationships with. But we often do things like jQuery or Bootstrap or something else files like that off other people's CDNs. And we generally believe that doing that has a performance advantage. Even when we pay Akamai or Fastly a metric ton of money to give us a fast experience. And one of the theories behind loading jQuery off somebody else's, off a common CDN, is if another site uses it, you'll get it in your cache. But I'll put the phone away. But if you have an iOS device, what happens is iOS partitions its cache. So if you've got site A and site B, and they both load jQuery from site C, you will end up with two versions of copies of jQuery in your cache, because iOS double keys its cache to protect against tracking. So the whole theory that you should load jQuery from a common CDN, I've never believed, because there are too many versions of jQuery out there. But right now, iOS is completely breaking that model. So if you have a CDN and you are using jQuery or something else from Google APIs or Cloudflare or somewhere else, stop doing it. Is my view. So third parties are infrastructure and code managed by somebody else. And if we look at the data from the HTTP archive, what we can see is over time, we are starting to use more and more of them. There are gaps because there's data missing for some HTTP archive runs. But we can see at the median, it's creeping up slowly. At the 75th percentile, it's creeping up a bit faster. And then at the 90th and 95th percentile, we are using lots of third parties. These, at the 95th percentile, 200 third parties on our sites. So we love to stick stuff from other people on our sites. And why not? Because we've got plenty of things to choose from. This is from the Chief Martech blog, run by Scott Brinker and Anand Thacker. And they call it the Martech 5000. They started doing this chart in 2011, and they could find 150 third parties you could put on your site at that point. By 2012, they got to 350, and by May last year, they determined there were 5,000 different third-party services you could put on your site. And why wouldn't you put them on there? Because they're going to make us money. It's the thing. It's only a little bit of JavaScript, and it's going to make you millions. And that's the sale that's made to everybody. But the reality is a bit more mixed, a bit more harsh. And as Tim Cadleck, who is in London tonight and didn't come along, and Patrick is busily ribbing him over Twitter about it.
He even asked me for a ticket.
He even asked you for a ticket, and he didn't come along. As Tim said a few years ago, and wisely said, and as much as I hate to admit that about Tim, that everything should have a value because everything has a cost. And one of our challenges when it comes to third parties is, one, understanding their value. What does a third party really give us? And in some cases, that's really hard. In the case of analytics, how do you value analytics? You wouldn't run a site without analytics, but how do you know what it's worth? Whereas with, say, a referral network, you can track what the value of the visitors it brings to you is, how much they spend. You can do an attribution model. But everything we put on our site has a cost. And as we're about to find out, some third parties in particular can have quite an interesting cost. So how can we measure their cost to begin with? And as I wrote a book on Webpagetest, it won't surprise you that one of my favorite tools for doing it is Webpagetest. And where I typically start is I test the page in Webpagetest. I repeat with some of the third parties blocked, that's all of the third parties blocked, and compare the two results. And in Webpagetest, this is the field. This is the easiest way to block third parties, is just add them to the block field. And then what we can do is we compare the two tests. And the film strip is a wonderfully powerful way of doing that. You can put a film strip in front of anybody and they will get it. You can't see it on this FT screen, but one of the things you'll notice here, and this is when you're blocking Webpagetest, you're blocking both the network overhead of it and the JavaScript execution of it. One of the things you might notice here is you can't see it. If you're lucky enough to be able to see one of the video screens, and it's only those people there, you'll see that there's actually a pink block here on both of them, where on this one, where the image is only partially decoded. And although we talk about the network cost of third parties, they also have a JavaScript cost. In that, in Chrome in particular, part of the process of decoding images can be blocked by JavaScript, and particularly marshalling back and forth between the image decoder and the script, the main thread. So in this case, although the image is there, some JavaScript that's running on the page is actually blocked the image from decoding. So we can compare using a film strip, and we can see that in the one where we block the third parties, it starts to render quicker, and we can see that it actually finishes rendering quicker, and makes a huge difference. But one of the things I always think about is, does this piece here really matter? Does it matter once the person's got the experience, unless the JavaScript is getting in the way? And then having produced a film strip, and particularly if we go back here and seeing how that page renders more quickly, and ultimately how it loads more quickly, we can take those time savings and plug them into a run product like ours or Soasters or Blue Triangle, and understand that if we make it faster, what does that mean from us in terms of conversion? How does it affect our conversion? How does it affect our revenue? So we can use Webpagetest to generate a model, put it into real world data, and get the business impact. And yeah, there's a real world business impact. So this is a real customer. This is a retailer. And does anybody notice anything about the chart? Something happened here. One, you'll notice Android is much, much slower than iOS. And that's not unusual, because Android's JavaScript performance is awful. Partly because it has crappier processors in Android devices, and JavaScript is essentially single-threaded, except if you've got web workers. But what this customer did at this point is remove Bazaar Voice for Android visitors. We determined that actually executing Bazaar Voice for Android visitors was taking 4 seconds. They still have it for iOS. If we go back here, iOS has stayed flat, but they removed it for Android visitors, and it saved them 4 seconds in terms of overall page load time. So the experience was there. It's just you couldn't interact with it very well. And that 4-second saving actually resulted in a 26% increase in revenue. And we measured this week on week over an 8-week period. Because one of the challenges in measuring retail is they always have an offer on. They are always sending out emails to somebody saying, buy this thing's on a discount. So what we actually did is compare Android traffic to iOS traffic to see how they changed over the period. And 26% is quite a conservative number. That's the number they took to the board. If I look at the beginning and the end, I can see 100% increase. But yeah, so removing Bazaar Voice had a huge impact for them. So third parties don't just cost us money, we're paying them to provide the service. They cost us in terms of how they affect our user experience. So one of the things to do is understand how third parties affect the key milestones on your site. Yes, question?
I'm not particularly familiar with that program. Can you talk just for a minute about what business value they thought they were getting for that 25% loss of revenue?
Okay, so Bazaar Voice is a reviews third party. So if I buy a dress to go on my shirt, you can give it a number of stars. You can put comment on it. It's about social proof. It's about the challenge that we go to buy things online and we are seeing pictures of an item. We don't know how well it fits us. So things like Bazaar Voice and FIFO and some of the others give.
How much sales increase for them by adding in that social validation?
No, they don't in this situation. But it's one of the things that social proof is a well-known marketing technique. It's whether companies measure it all the time, or whether they believe that having the social proof actually delivers value, whether they measure it or not. Yeah, there's, in that case, the cost of actually the third party and the performance impact it brought was higher than the social proof cost. The interesting one would be to do the same thing for, say, iOS and see whether it had the same impact, but they're not quite willing to go there yet. So what I like to do is when I look at third parties, understand how they affect the key milestones on a site. So how do they affect when the content starts to appear? How do they affect once the content's appeared? How do they affect whether somebody can interact with it or how stuff appears? And the way I generally start out with that is looking for activity before first meaningful paint in Chrome developer tools. Yes, that's what this is. And what I tend to do is load the page in the performance tab in Chrome, and then find from the start of when navigation starts, highlight it to where something where I get my first frame with some content in, and then sort the view down the bottom to show me which of the third parties was occupying the main thread or which consumed the most. And in this case, we can see it's actually Adobe Tag Manager, which to those of you who use Adobe Tag Manager won't come as a surprise. But this is, you can do this for one page on your site. You can do it for tens of pages on your site. You can do it on other people's sites, but doing it in bulk is really hard. So I wanted to understand, okay, so in this case, which was Xfinity, which is a US site, Adobe Tag Manager was their thing that was causing them the most blockage. And I wanted to look at, okay, so what about a wider group of sites? What are really the render blockers on the internet? And what I did is HTTP archive. Anybody not heard of the HTTP archive? Anybody need it explained? Everybody comfortable with it? Hey, no, right, good. Okay, HTTP archive.
Oh, sorry, I didn't hear what you said.
All right.
Something else.
No.
Yeah, I think you should still explain.
I'll explain it. Right, so HTTP archive grabs, runs Webpagetest on 5,000 URLs twice a month. And what they do is try to build up a picture of how the internet is built and how the internet is performing. But as well as the aggregate data that's on httparchive.org, they grab a whole bunch of other data that they put into Google BigQuery, so you can go and query it, including details of all the requests, how big they are, how long they took, things like that. They also grab har files for everything and the content for everything, so you can search it. And the other thing they do is they actually grab Chrome timelines for every page they check. And if you know where to find those Chrome timelines, or you can ask Pat Neenan nicely and he tells you, and they're here, you can pull a Chrome timeline down for every one of those page loads. And then once you've got those Chrome timelines, you can use, John Pierre Vincent wrote something called Third-Party Abuser. I wrote a bunch of changes to it to analyze those timelines. So you can use marker points. You can say, okay, show me what JavaScript executed before first meaningful paint. You could say, show me what JavaScript executed before first paint. And then when you aggregate the results, you get charts like this that show that just out of the top 5,000 internet sites in the world, these are distributions. So the height is frequency, and the x-axis is how long they consumed the CPU for. And what we can see is, all sorts of things turn up on our critical path to blocking rendering. We have things like add this and Twitter, and somewhere down here is Facebook, which are not really critical things to happen on our web page. We have tag managers like Telium and Google Tag Manager and Adobe. And then we have some other bits, but we have Optimizely here somewhere, if I could see it. Yeah, it's the one with the very long curve. But even with Google Tag Manager, in one of these cases, Google Tag Manager delays the page rendering or runs for 1 second and 3/4 in CPU terms. We see things like in Titan, lots of them are fast, but there are some really, really long tail stragglers. DoubleClick is the worst, where on this site, DoubleClick ran for 2.5 seconds for page rendering. So we can begin to understand how much of these resources that, we tend to look at network waterfalls and see how long a network request block, but the JavaScript they often load is often just as bad. And Optimizely, everybody's thing to hate is, some of it's fast, and then we can see that it stretches out where, the second, there's another one here that blocks for 2 seconds. So the stuff we're putting on our page makes a huge, huge difference to our user experience without even thinking about it. And, let's pick on one of them. We'll pick on Optimizely because, cheap target. And, I know people who tend to think of Optimizely as a necessary evil rather than something they love. And looking at Optimizely is replotting that data in a different way. We begin to see that, how you implement Optimizely affects what its cost is. So it's often not just the case of, you grab a third party off the shelf and you use it. It's about what you do within that implementation. That third party can have a real difference to how it performs. It sits on the critical rendering path. And here is how long, in this case, it blocked the network for on xbox.com. So its script took the best part of 1/3 of a second to come down, and then took about another 150 milliseconds to execute. So, we tend to think about how long things take to download. I've got a customer example at the moment where the script takes about 3/4 second to download, and then takes another 1/2 second to execute on an iPhone, for example, on a modern iPhone. So, the JavaScript cost of these is huge. And there are things we can do to speed it up. And understanding these, and it's relevant for lots of our third parties, can make a big difference. So things that affect Optimizely's performance is how many URL matches in it. If we're matching hundreds of pages, it's slower than matching a few. How many experiments we've got. We've got somebody who's currently, as I said down the bottom, stop using Optimizely's jQuery and use your own, reduces its size and speeds it up. I've got somebody who's currently going through this process at the moment. But unfortunately, while they're swapping over, they've duplicated their experiments. So they've got more experiments and more plugins, so it's taking longer in the short term. So how many experiments you're running in Optimizely has a huge impact on how it affects things. How many plugins you've got, whether you have, even if you're not using a plugin, if you have it in your Optimizely script, it will be downloaded. So doing things like archiving old experiments. He's gone for pizza, isn't he? Archiving old experiments, making sure that only the experiments you want to use in live are there is really important when it comes to the performance of Optimizely. Some other things you can do, and I'd encourage you. Optimizely gets a bad rep, but one place Optimizely is really good is it has an API, and it has an API that you can use to query what's going on with it. So you can see how many experiments are actually in the snippet, how many are live for the current user or current visitor. So one of the things I'd encourage you to do is, if you do use Optimizely, grab this data out and beacon it back to your analytics or your RUM data, so you can start to understand the relationship between what you've got in your script and what visitors' performance is actually like. Optimizely collect a huge amount of data about how their script actually performs on your site. If you have a look at it, they're busy collecting resource timing for their scripts and sending it back to themselves. They set performance marks when their script executes, and they're sending it all back. And if you haven't got a RUM product that can do this, what I encourage you is to beat up your local Optimizely customer success manager, they're called, aren't they? And talk to them about how you can get access to this data, because they can give you that data. They can do things like query their API to understand when you've got how often you use your experiments. You know, do you have a plugin or experiment in live that you haven't used for 3 months because it was for last Black Friday's promotion? So that one of the interesting things that's in some browsers at the moment is the long task API, where we can begin to understand how long scripts are taking on the browser, so we can see how many times that script takes over 50 milliseconds. In the version we've got at the moment, we can't actually attribute it back to the script, but there are ways of doing it. To stop picking on Optimizely for a moment, some other things you should think about in your A/B testing is avoid redirects. Working with a client who was using Adobe Target from memory, and one of their A/B tests sent people to their current homepage. One of them sent them to a revised version of the homepage. Unfortunately, it did a redirect in the middle, so it took twice as long. And we all know speed matters. So that redirect invalidated the test. The other thing we've seen is people with a 30K image in one variant and a 300K image in the other. So, and they weren't testing that in whether the larger, better quality image had an effect. It was completely accidental. So, you know, if we're doing A/B testing or MVT, it's really important to make sure the tests are equivalent, so that what we're measuring, or we're measuring equal things. But, you know, what about if we could move beyond relying on putting megabytes of JavaScript on the client? You know, what if we could move A/B testing to the server side? You know, there are server-side A/B testing products out there. There are CMSs. There is pizza. There are CMSs like SiteSpect that allow you to do it in the CMS. And one of my bugbears is that, you know, testing variants is something everybody wants to do. So why doesn't every CMS support it out of the box? There are things like Fastly and Akamai have service you can test at the CDN level. There are people like Netlify, and if you go find Phil Hawkes' feed on Twitter, he's got some videos recently where he shows how to do A/B testing at Netlify and how to track the results. So taking A/B testing away from the client, away from the visitor's browser, and moving it onto the server side. So before they even get the content, you know, it removes the network cost, it removes the JavaScript cost. It makes the experience better. The other thing, and not quite the last thing I'm going to say on A/B testing, is know how to turn it off in an emergency. We had a client who was A/B testing login button variations. I don't know who their provider was at the time, but their A/B testing provider was running into problems and couldn't keep up with their site. Now, in the normal situations, you turn off A/B testing. But when you have a login-only site and both variations of your login button are being put on with the A/B testing framework, you can't turn it off. So understand how to turn it off. Write tests for things like that with a fallback. Because removing A/B testing in the client can deliver you business benefits. And here's another client. Retailer, well-known retailer, has a fast site. Their median load time is about 1.5 seconds, measured for all the visitors to their site. And they decided to remove Optimizely and do A/B testing another way. And it shaved off 150 milliseconds on iOS devices and 300 milliseconds off Android. And that increased their revenue by 5%. So even on a really fast site, removing JavaScript, removing client-side render blockers can deliver a performance improvement. Now, What if I told you that the pizza was still warm and you should go and get some?
What do you want? Pizza? Finish
Yes.
the talk.
Pizza. Finish the cool.
Finish the talk. Yeah, it's
So-
okay.
What if I told you that it's impossible to find a Creative Commons version of a picture of Morpheus on the web? So you have to settle for somebody who's got a Morpheus doll and taken a picture of it in an armchair. Or when we talk about loading scripts, we make recommendations about putting them at the foot of our document before the close of the body, or loading them async. Because if we load them async, they're not render blocking. But what if I told you that a script loaded async and even injected after the page had already loaded can delay a page from rendering? Who would believe me? Oh, few people have faith in me. Patrick, you didn't put your hand up. And you've seen this talk before. So, here's a question for you. Here is a waterfall from Chrome DevTools. And my question, and it has to be somebody who's brave enough at the front and can actually read the thing. What was the first request in this navigation? Yeah. Anybody else want to take another guess? What's the obvious thing? You've all done this in Chrome DevTools many times. Right. So you think that it's game.co.uk. What if I showed you exactly the same request in Webpagetest? And game.co.uk was actually request number 61. And there were all these other requests before it. You might be sort of like this, thinking, what the hell is going on? Well, when we think about pages loading, we often think about the waterfalls we produce in Chrome DevTools, or we go to Webpagetest and stick in game.co.uk and load it. But lots of our visitors don't come that way. Lots of our visitors actually navigate from another page in game or from another site. And what you can see is that in the case of game, is this thing called before unload that in this case took 420 milliseconds to execute. And we can see that as part of down in this JavaScript stack, oh, it took 400 milliseconds to execute. I put myself some notes. You can see it took 400 milliseconds to execute its JavaScript. And somewhere down here in cloning the DOM, because this is from a third party called Tleaf, that at the before hijacks, listens to the before unload event and runs some JavaScript on it and clones the DOM and then cleans up any privacy information and then beacons it back. Cloning the DOM triggers a whole bunch of network requests. We can see these blue lines down here, which are all these images. I'm not completely convinced the wrong way around. So cloning the DOM causing those image requests may be a Chrome bug, because I've not seen this behavior in any other browser, but in every other browser, you still get the 400 milliseconds it takes to execute. And game is not the only place this happens. I think this is Rolling Stone magazine, where there are actually 9 before unload event handlers that take a total 1.8 seconds to execute. This is pretty much because the Oracle Ads Network is making synchronous XHR requests for its Pixel. So these things come up quite often. They're not isolated cases. I just looked at Tleaf across the top 10,000 sites on HB Archive it is, and Motads, which is Oracle's one, and we can see that it's not uncommon for some of them to block navigation for 2.5 seconds. And this is really, really hard to measure because the navigation timing API doesn't actually measure the before unload event. It doesn't measure it for privacy reasons, although we're talking about how we can fix this. So, we measure page load from navigation start to somewhere over here where the onload event fires. But in some cases, there's already a 2-second delay before navigation start that we don't see. So Charlie Vazak of Akamai gave me this sketch of code as one way of how you can measure it, how you can add your own event listener in, or hijack add event listener, listen before unload events, and listen and measure them. Don't take this code as it is, because of course you have to instrument your own remove event listener as well. I, of course, went for Webpagetest. And there's a nicer way of doing this now. But essentially, you can write a Webpagetest script that navigates to a page and then navigates to the page again. And the second navigation will trigger the before unload event for the first page. You can download the timeline, and then you can run it through this beautiful bit of JQ down here. Has anybody heard of JQ? Cool. So JQ is marketed as like sed for JSON. And what this does is it feeds the timeline into JQ. We go and select the events that are named event dispatch, and for before unload, we get their duration and add them all up and divide them by 1,000. So you can work out how long they took, and that's how I produced those charts before. And finally, you can use DevTools. Although using DevTools means you've got to eyeball them all by hand. I'm not sure what the right way to solve the problem is, but it's a problem we sort of really need to work out how to solve, because the reality is a lot of our run metrics may be wrong for people who use tea-leaf motads, and excuse me, probably some of the other sites are hijacked before unload. Patrick's looking confused. And he's seen this before. So that's enough about picking on those sorts of third parties. Let's pick on some other third parties. Who includes adverts in their sites? There's 3 gentlemen at the back who won't put their hands up. But adverts are interesting. Lots of third parties. We have a contract with somebody. We pay Optimizely money to put their content on their page. With adverts, we let other people bid, decide how much they want to pay to put their random content on our page. And, sometimes we end up with dodgy adverts. Other times, we end up with cryptocurrency miners. And cryptocurrency miners on other people's sites, as much as the advertising networks try hard to keep them out, isn't that uncommon. So Doug Sellers, who has spoken here before, did a blog post on the Discuss HP Archive where he was looking at how many people had cryptocurrency mining scripts on their site, and it was a frightening number. There was another incident recently that Scott Helm talked about where people had writable S3 buckets, and somebody was going around replacing some of the scripts in the S3 buckets with crypto mining scripts, so they were ending up on people's sites. So, there's a real challenge when we allow other people to put content on our site. We take a huge risk. And ads, this was from Ad Lightning, who are a company who specialize in reviewing ads, but the IAB guidelines say ads should be 300K. Reality is they're 1.1 on average. They should make 50 network requests according to the IAB guideline. That's a hell of a lot still. But in reality, they make 56, just to be sure. They steal our processor. Video ads consume 3 seconds of CPU time to register render an ad and use a browser. And that's 3 seconds where your visitor to your site can't do something. It's probably 3 seconds spread over a little bit. And people are still using Flash, bless them. Is it any wonder people use ad blockers? But the challenge of the reality is we won't pay for content. You know, the Guardian is in a position where I think they get more money from people who support them than they do for advertising. But for lots of sites, we won't just pay. So, you know, the advertising, those sites have to be paid for somehow. And advertising is often the only way. So it's one of the reasons why advertisers are trying to clean up and improve the quality of the ads through the IAB ad portfolio. It's one of the ideas between AMP ads about making ads a bit more lighter weight, a bit faster to render. If you've got ads, performance APIs can help to build a picture to a certain extent, but it depends whether the ads are in an iframe. You know, again, it's resource timing to work out when it was requested, on long tasks to work out how long they took. But there are still many, many blind spots. Back last year, I tried working with a client to try and use content security policy. Anybody familiar with content security policy? For those of you who aren't, it's a HTTP header where you can declare what types of content you're willing to let run on your page and where it can come from. And if it fails those rules, then it doesn't execute. Subject source integrity is the way of generating a hash for every file you've got on your site you include from somebody else, include from somewhere else. And if it fails the hash, then the browser won't execute it. We got partially somewhere between it. We actually found it was better using content security policy in report mode to begin with, so we could see what the range of third parties they had. We then used it to limit down the third parties they knew about, but where they had a media buying agency putting stuff in their affiliate window container, or they had adverts coming in from somewhere, they could only report on what those adverts were. And we didn't really get anywhere with subject source integrity at all. So adverts really are the casino. You run the risk of upsetting your users, of serving them shit every time you put an advert on your site, unfortunately. And finally, let's talk about my other love from the third-party world, the tag manager. Who likes tag managers? You, sir? Mm-hmm. So that's the real thing, isn't it? Tag managers make it really easy to put tags on the site. They came around because change processes within IT, which is where websites live for a long time, were too slow. And marketing is both a strategic and a tactical activity. So, you know, tag managers make it really, really easy to add tags to your site. And for people who, we might say, don't know what they're doing, to add tags or don't understand the performance indication. But on the other side, it makes it really easy to take them off too. Technically, at least. We actually have, so as tag managers make it technically really easy to put them on, they also make it really easy technically to take them off. Of course, to take them off, you have to win the business discussion with who owns the tags, and that's where the challenge comes. But one thing some people do with it really successfully is they use it as a source of truth and an audit trail. So one of the retailers, I don't think we work with anymore, I think we certainly worked with in the past, they use their tag manager as their audit trail and their source of truth. So the IT operations people had the permission that if they had any badly behaving third parties, they could take it off. They could use the tag manager to take it off. And it was a way of, it formed a method of communication between the marketing people, the e-commerce people, and the people who had to run the site and were responsible for its performance on a day-to-day basis. So they're not all bad. The other thing they do is they help police what goes on from a loading point of view, because every third party will tell you, put me in the head, I won't affect your performance. And tag managers make it really easy to do things like to control where something loads, to help manage what data they've got access to and what data they can see. So as much as we see tweets about huge long waterfalls like this, and it's all down to the tag managers are an important place and give us a way to help control our third parties. Because ultimately, third parties, or it's about finding the balance between the value and the cost of third parties. And the biggest thing I would encourage you to do is to go and talk to people in your business who own third parties, who want them on your site, and help understand from them what value they're giving. I can tell you the case of one client we looked at where when we went through this exercise, nobody knew who owned a third of the third parties. In another case, 25% of the contracts had expired. So from the point of view, just going to those people and helping establish the value and what they're getting out of them is really important. But then, we understand how browsers work. We understand the technologies, and help doing things like producing Webpagetest waterfalls and taking that to them and helping them understand what those third parties are costing them from a user point of view is really important too, because we will end up having to mediate those conversations because we're amongst the people who understand both sides. And we want to build a better web for everybody. Third parties are a necessary evil. Thank you.
Pizzas are still steaming hot, so don't worry. If you've got some questions, please do ask. Right, okay, let's go.
Thanks for the talk. I just wanted to ask about you mentioned the CDN iOS double caching thing. I was just curious to dive into that a little bit more. Because iOS do it differently to everyone else, would you say we shouldn't do it at all and we should load it for our own CDN? Or is it like, is there a bit more nuance to it than that?
So the theory has always been that if you load jQuery from
like Google
APIs, you have some hope that when somebody comes to your site, they've already got it from Google APIs. The reality is, if you look at how many versions of jQuery out there, there's a huge number out there. And in reality, not that many sites load it from a common CDN. You've also got the challenge of we roll through browser caches, because browser caches are much smaller, particularly on mobile devices. They're much smaller. We roll through the contents of our browser cache pretty quickly. I've not done the exercise, but if you look at the Yahoo study from 10 years ago now, and the Facebook one from a couple of years ago, I think it's something like crazy, like 50–60% of times somebody went back to Facebook, the file that Facebook had placed in the cache wasn't there. And if the most popular website on the internet can't guarantee stuff that's in their cache, what hope do any of us have? So I've always been skeptical of the choice to use jQuery and whatnot from a common CDN, particularly if you've got your own CDN. And to me, particularly in the retail space, iOS doing this thing where they key them, double key them, so they're considered separately. And it's just the death of it. If you've got a site that you're running on a budget that you don't have a CDN for, yes, carry on doing it, but don't do it for performance reasons, is my view. If you have jQuery on your site and you're paying Fastly or Akamai or Cloudflare or somebody else's CDN, coast it yourself.
Cool, thanks.
Any more? Anyone else?
Which direction is things going? Like, are these third-party scripts getting better or getting worse?
Oh.
Which third-party script are we talking about?
Are they getting better or getting worse?
This is becoming a known about thing. Is the pressure from developers pushing them to improve that, or not necessarily they don't care?
They care where you can make a business value association. So back in January, I at a client, I met with the product owner for Optimizely, for example, and their COO and stuff like that. And they are starting to think about how you can do things like you can have a separate snippet for staging and live, so you don't have to have them all munged together. How you can do things like make it easy to not have experiments or the plugins for experiments, and then you're not using plugged in. So where commercial pressure is applied to those third parties, then I see some of those third parties changing. But there's an education piece, isn't it? Their customers have to understand that there's a cost for them involved beyond the cost of just paying for the service, and use that to then apply commercial pressure to the third parties.
Okay.
Just for a bit of context, we run predominantly on retailers. We probably got about 250 live clients, predominantly UK at the moment. I'm yet to find any of them who've made any sort of performance comment. The majority of them will do things like you mentioned, like they will give us full access to all of their tag manager, so we can do whatever we like. We behave, promise. They'll do things like the live state, like everything's live. They don't have concept. I think the main thing is that, and this is sort of a question for you, I guess, isn't it? Do you feel like you're pitching to the wrong audience? Like, I would hope that everyone in a web performance meetup cares about performance in some form, but the majority of the people that we speak to are marketing execs. They don't even know how the web works, let alone whether it's fast or not.
So am I pitching the wrong audience? This is my community. I talk to my community. Commercially, I spend a lot of time talking to e-commerce directors, e-commerce managers, marketing directors. I spend probably more time talking to them than I spend talking to techies, to be honest.
This community really wants to reach that space, right? So I would say, send all your customers to us and we'll educate them about the use of your service.
Kind of a follow-up to what both you sort of talking at here, Andy. I mean, you answered there, who do you talk to, which was going to be my question. Who are your clients that you're having this conversation with? And I've certainly developed stuff that has shipped as a plugin, right? Service plugin, add-on service to put in a website or to deploy through someone else's website. And I'm sitting there as an engineer who's attended these conferences before going, how do I convince their software engineers that this isn't going to jam up or mess up their site? If they've been here and they've heard this, they're wary of it. So there are people out there who are wary of it. Where's our seal? Where's our standard? You know, without having to get into an hour-long conversation each time I'm shipping this, something I can just say in that email that's saying, plug this in, it meets this. That'd be a lovely thing if there's a proven link somewhere on Webpagetest and say, here it is. Here's where it compares.
So Andrew Betts, who now works at Fastly, used to work at the FT, along with a bunch of other people, created something called JS Manners good few years ago to try and give people a way of evaluating third parties. And unfortunately, never got quite as much traction as we'd have liked. But you know, my view, the whole third party argument is about the value and cost. It's about selling web performance to people, and it comes as part of that conversation. And it's about this costs you money, because that's the only way you reach them. Well, I work for consultancy. I go and help them do it. So, you know, there are, yeah. I win some and I lose some. Just
one more? No, you go.
So most of the things that you were talking about, it applied to something like e-commerce sites where, when they improve the performance of their website, they gain a revenue. But what about sites which, for example, there is some subscription? For example, the whole company buys a product and all of their employees have to use it. So when that product is slower, they will not stop using it, right? So what would do? So because they are kind of forced, let's say, because there's the company policy or something like that. So what would be the performance recommendation for products like that?
So it depends on whether people have to use it or not. So one of the pieces of work we've done previously is with behind the firewall employee systems, where you've got, if you can make it faster, you increase employee productivity. You reduce employee angst. There was a situation where somebody had an internal system that everybody hated using, and once they fixed the performance of it, people still didn't love it, but they got people to use. It's about, if you have things that aren't e-commerce related, performance affects how much people do. So, gentleman from the Telegraph back, when things are faster, people read more web news, don't they? So it's a human behavioral thing. So in e-commerce world, it's easiest to make the link between performance and revenue, because they all care about how much they're making. In where the return isn't as clear, there are ways of doing it through, how well people engage with the site, if it's public, or if it's not public, how effective you're helping make people at work. And that is harder to measure, because there's people like dollars, pounds, euros. Employee time is always a bit more fuzzy around the edge.
There's also the aspect of like something that happened like a lot for me in my career is that, performance can also affect scale. Yeah, and scale equals like the number of consumers that you can get through sites. So, and then that again ends up impacting on overall revenues or overall ad clicks and that kind of stuff. So there's always it's not just about the individual user, it's about how your whole infrastructure can serve a site as well. So there's that aspect of performance. We don't often cover load testing at this group now. We have done in the past and stuff like that, but it's an important facet of performance testing for sure. Any more? Or pizza time? Pizza time. Pizza time. Anyway, let's one more thank you for Andy. Yeah.